Well, welcome to Week 3, Module 2, Creating a Culture of Achievement. To prepare for this week, you already have read Fisher, Fry, and Pumpy in Chapter 3. You've thought about purposely creating a culture in your school by becoming more welcoming to all of your stakeholders, including and especially your students. And the purpose of this week is to start thinking about how our discipline and rules affect learning. Obviously, student learning is our major focus and outcome and responsibility as a school. So how does our discipline and rules affect learning? And to help each of us start thinking about proposing ways that we can build a safe and learning culture, both within our current sphere of influence and our future sphere of influence. Schools, like any organization, any environment, it can't function without rules, without some expectations for behaviors. Often you walk into any school and there's a student handbook, and the handbook is full of all the rules, all the do's, all the don'ts, all the things by educational code that can lead to suspension or expulsion, the things the school expects and doesn't expect of students. Every school is required to have a student handbook of rules. We also have staff handbooks as well. We thought, when we looked at that, all those sets of rules, what did we really want students to walk away with? And we said at the beginning of our handbook that in addition to everything you read in this handbook that you're about to sign, your parents are about to sign, think about the big idea here. And the big idea here is all these rules are created so you don't do harm. You don't do harm to yourself, you don't do harm to others, and you don't do harm to the environment. If you look at every one of our rules, it relates to one of those things. So if you don't memorize the entire student handbook, think about the next thing you're about to do. If it's not going to hurt yourself, if it's not going to hurt others, it's not going to hurt the environment, you could probably make an argument it's not against the rules. But if you are putting yourself in a position where you are or could be hurt, where you are or could be hurting others, whether you are or could be hurting the school environment, the community environment, the likelihood is you're breaking a rule. And when we looked at do no harm from that perspective, it was the same rule we could apply to every stakeholder of our school. Our students, our faculty, our staff, our administration, our partners, our visitors, our families. Do no harm to yourself, do no harm to others, and do no harm to the environment. And all of a sudden, this student handbook became part of the curriculum. It became alive because what better lesson or what more necessary lesson would we want any student to leave school with other than having this notion of my actions affect others. I have to think about how my actions affect myself and others in the world. And I have to take responsibility for that. If we don't teach that, then the rest of our curriculum is pretty ineffective. So do no harm is part of our notion, the pillar that we used in the book to talk about creating a safe learning environment. Because without a safe learning environment, as Maslow would say, the idea of meeting our physiological needs and our safe and secure needs, our belonging needs, our self-esteem needs are going to be limited, are going to be thwarted, and therefore our ability to really find ourselves, our agency as a learner, as a teacher, as a citizen, as a member will be minimized. Creating a safe learning environment is one of the primary responsibilities of a leader to help their entire community create. And we believe that we begin this conversation by teaching everybody in our school culture that hurting yourself and hurting others and hurting the environment is not acceptable. We're responsible for more than that. We're responsible for first doing no harm. So the question we began asking ourselves as we looked at this issue, and we were heavily influenced, and we're heavily influenced in our writing in the book about the notion of restorative practice, is what we do opening up our students to learning, or is what we do shutting them down? Students behave. We act. Do our actions increase learning or shut down kids from learning? So in the book that I'm going to encourage you to start reading now, the Watchell book on restorative practice, you'll see the following phrase. If a child can't read, we teach him to read. And if a child can't do math problems, we teach them to do math problems. And if a child doesn't know how to behave, we punish them. So why isn't teaching appropriate behavior helping kids learn that there's consequences for their action and their responsibility? They have responsibilities for their action, not only teaching that as a punishment when they do it wrong, but as part of what we teach them so they do it right. And so the Restorative Practices Handbook is one of the books that was on your syllabus that we asked you to order. I'm not asking you to read them chapters for particular weeks. I'm asking you now begin to read the book and finish the book. And as you read this book, you're going to get a much deeper understanding of the do no harm pillar and of practices associated with being restorative rather than just punitive in the way we deal with aberrant behavior that our students demonstrate. We have to start thinking about, and what chapter 3 do no harm is, and what the restorative practices philosophy is about our consequences to students' actions. So what's the consequence for being late? If the consequence for being late is to send students to a room so they miss more school, how much sense does that make? Why do we want students to be on time? We want students to be on time because we value every instructional minute. So if a student is late and we lock him out of the classroom, and he has to go somewhere for another half hour, instead of missing 5 minutes of class, he misses 35 minutes of class. And in missing 35 minutes of class, he's going to come to class the next day further behind. He's going to be more frustrated. He's going to be more lost. He's going to be less inclined to be motivated to be in the class. So the likelihood is he'll be late again because it's less punishing for him to be outside of a frustrating classroom, the classroom he's behind in, than in it. So being late, the consequences make him later. Being late because the student had all kinds of issues of getting to school and saying, why are you here, instead of we're glad you're here, how can we help you be on time tomorrow? What are the consequences to the action of being late? Being late is not acceptable. It's irresponsible behavior, whether you're late to work or school or to an appointment or to be with your friends. How do you learn to take responsibility for being on time? How do you get the support you need to develop that habit? And how does that failing to have developed that habit a consequence that keeps you from rather than gets you into learning? It's a consequence for not having a pencil. He doesn't come to school prepared. Go to the office. Well, if he doesn't come to school prepared, the consequence is he gets a B instead of an A, even though he demonstrates he knows the material because he doesn't come to school prepared, or he doesn't come to school prepared without the pencil, so he has to leave. You read in chapter 3 that I, unfortunately, go to many meetings without my pencil and paper. I should. I'm glad other people do, but it's not a habit I've well developed. I've never been asked to leave a meeting. And I'm a very successful person overall. So how can we help our students? And it's not acceptable that I don't come with a pen or pencil, but something helps me out. So how can we teach a student who doesn't come with the appropriate materials to learn to come to with the appropriate materials? And at the same time, how do we not let that keep them from staying in class, from being included in the next lesson? As you read in the chapter, we came up with a very simple solution. We gave all our teachers a box of golf pencils. We bought a couple thousand pencils, so it's never an excuse that not having a pencil would be a reason a student would not be able to participate in an instructional activity. Again, we value our instructional time. The more time a student misses instruction, the more he or she's going to fall behind, the less they're going to learn. the less they're going to be inclined or motivated to catch up, because as all of us know, when we're behind, when we don't know what's going on, it's less likely we will participate. When we go to a movie halfway through the movie and we don't know how it started, we're less engaged than if we're at the movie. And so it's the same thing with school. The more time you in class, the more you benefit from class. The research is quite clear. You miss 10 days of class, likelihood is you're not going to have enough of the skills and knowledge to demonstrate the competencies to pass the class. Failure and absenteeism is great. So what happens when we suspend a kid 3 times for 3 days? We're guaranteeing his failure. Now, that's not to say that there are not actions that require suspensions, but do we take into account lost learning time? Do we take into account that some behaviors don't merit that sort of suspension, but may merit a different type of consequence and a different type of restoration that will reduce lost instructional time? What are our consequences for stealing? What are our consequences for cheating? These are consequences that may have a punitive aspect in them, but at their core, it's our responsibility to encourage kids to understand and learn that these are not acceptable, responsible behaviors. You're hurting other people. You're doing harm. You have to restore the harm you've created as part of the consequence, not just be sent home for 3 days and come back. What do kids learn by our reactions to their actions? We know that many kids, especially kids of color and males, that the consequences of repeated suspensions and repeated leaving the classroom and repeated lack of success is dropping out. And we can't afford that the consequences of our action are to increase the likelihood that we're just part of a prison and an unemployment and a poverty pipeline. We're supposed to be the alternatives to that. We have to take that responsibility very seriously. In the Restorative Practice book, you're going to see this little chart, and I just wanted to highlight it for you. There are 4 ways of responding to students, creating a culture responding to students' behavior. We can do things to them when they act out. This is called a high intervention with a low level of support. They're just dependent on us for telling them what's going to happen next. We confront them, we're the authority, we win, they lose. There's retribution, there's stigmatizing, now you're a criminal, now you're a cheater, now you're not trustworthy. Students either comply or they fight or flight. So when we do 2 things to them, it's the ultimate authority situation. We have, or we assume we have, power and authoritative relationship over them. We use it to the extent possible. It works for some kids, and for other kids it pushes out. But for most kids, they don't learn to behave, they just learn to comply. At the low end of support and the low end of control is we really don't care. Act the way you act. An uncaring environment where you get tired of kids, they burn out, they know they're not important to others, their actions are tolerated, they use them when they move on to the next stage in their life. They haven't really learned a consequence or a responsibility for their actions. Oftentimes people get our type of discipline of do no harm and restorative practices. We do things for kids, and it's completely wrong. This notion that high support but low control, we make excuses for kids. We're inconsistent in terms of how we deal with actions. We blur boundaries. We give in to excuses and societal pressures. We excuse. And when students hurt themselves or hurt others or hurt the environment, those aren't responsible and effective responses. They're not teaching. Restorative practice and doing no harm as part of a discipline policy and creating a safe school is our actions are developed with the students who have been perpetrators and with the students and others who have been victims. We're more consistent. We hold kids accountable and responsive for their behavior. We're flexible in how we're going to respond to it because we're engaging with them in solutions to the best way of restoring the situation. It's a matter of cooperation. It's a matter of taking responsibility and ownership. It's a matter of negotiating the best way of doing the next best right thing in terms of restoring the damage you've done and in terms of getting back to learning. You'll see from Chapter 3 a lot of discussion about the organizational principles behind do no harm, and restorative practice is certainly one of them. It's also talking about having a proactive classroom and good management skills. It's very closely and directly related to training that many of you have had around positive behavior supports, positive behavior interventions and supports, PBS and PBIS. Restorative practices, both in terms of low-stake and high-stake environments. Assessing the culture of your school is very important. How many suspensions are there? The ODR is office disciplinary referrals, suspensions, calls home, being sent to the office, expulsions. And that gives you some idea if there's a certain group of students or students who our method of responding to is just not being very effective and they're not learning more appropriate ways of behaving. How do we take surveys on how students feel about their involvement in school and action? There's some tools regarding that in the chapter as well. I want you to start thinking about what is your school's response in discipline policy. Is it keeping kids safe? Is it dealing with the perpetrators as well as the victims? Is it creating a culture in which learning to behave is part of the culture of learning to be an effective student? Or are the consequences interrupting learning and creating a more defiant relationship between some of the students we want to reach the most? In the book, Restorative Practice, you'll see this paradigm shift discussion, moving from traditional practices to restorative practice. Traditional discipline, we look at schools and school rules have been violated. In restorative practices, we look at people and relationships that have been violated. We move from focusing on guilt to focusing on needs and obligations, from punishment to understanding the impact of our action and repairing the harm, from directing the offender while the victim is ignored, to dealing with the offender and the victim in a school that all have roles in the justice process, from rules and intent outweigh whether the outcome is negative or positive, to the offender being responsible for harmful behavior or impairing the harm and working towards a positive outcome for everybody involved. To traditional discipline, there's no real opportunity for remorse or amends. It's not part of the restoration, to a process where people can learn and see the results of their action and try to make amends for it. In the book, and certainly beyond the scope of this overview, the restorative practice is a philosophy that really begins to give students much more voice in how schools are operated, gives much more opportunity to be heard and the responsibility to listen to others. So as we go from low stakes issues to high stakes issues, the culture already has within it the notion that there's a lot of conversation, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of listening. I also recommend you pick up the book on restorative practice on circles, because circles are a great low-stake way of introducing into school a culture of kids and adults talking with each other and having their voice heard. The Do No Harm Reflection Pillar Post 2 that is going to be due next week has the following prompts. You're going to write, when it comes to the concept of do no harm, I believe. So how do you feel about this concept of do no harm? As it relates to your future sphere of influence, as a school leader, how would your beliefs be reflected in your school's discipline policies and practices? In other words, what do you believe about do no harm and being more restorative and being more positive? And if you were the school leader in the future, how would those beliefs be reflected in your school's discipline policies and practices? In the future, as a school leader, how would your beliefs be reflected in program practices and initiatives? What do you think would be good ideas to put in practice? In your future sphere of influence, how would your beliefs be reflected in professional development that you gave to your community of learners, to your staff? Would this notion be something that's in your own professional development? And is the concept of teaching students to first do no harm apply to your current school culture or workplace? And finally, how does that response sit with you? Is your school in a good place as it comes to restorative practice and being positive? Are those things built into the culture of your school? Are victims as well as perpetrators dealt with openly and fairly and honestly? Is there open communication about restoration? Now, step 7 of your prompt, just like you did last week for things you can do immediately to make your school welcoming, what 5 things can you do this semester to create a more positive, restorative, make your school a more positive, restorative place? So what are the 5 things you can do this semester to make your school a more positive, restorative place? And again, at the end of the semester, you're going to go back and revisit those 5 commitments, your progress on them, lessons learned about them, and how those 5 things have helped make your school the best school in the universe. When it comes to next week, you're going to reflect on Pillar 2, and you're going to post your Do No Harm post. You're going to read Fisher, Fry, and Pumpy in Chapter 4, and you're going to start getting into the Costello, Wacho, and Wacho's Restorative Practice book. Again, this book will provide a lot of depth into what our Chapter 3 of Do No Harm was, and start giving you some tools you can work and build on in terms of restorative practice. I urge you, if you see restorative practice training in your area, to get it, as well as positive behavior supports. If you want more information about restorative practices and people who might be able to do professional development for you or for your school, feel free to drop me a note. Have a great week, and do no harm.